Hey guys, today we step into the worst dinner party in history, where no one RSVP'd, but everyone was invited anyway. We're talking about what people ate during the Black Death, that horrifying pandemic of the 14th century that made sure your meal wasn't just your last course, it might be your last breath. Between starvation, superstition, and sheer panic, dinner during the plague wasn't just about calories. It was about survival, sanity, and sometimes straight-up guesswork. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Imagine a market square in 1348. 1 month ago, it was loud, pungent, and full of life. Bakers shouting, fishmongers gutting, kids snatching apples from unattended carts. Now, silence. The stalls are empty. The doors are barred. And somewhere in the alleys, a bell tolls, not for a feast, but a funeral. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it starved entire communities. Trade collapsed. Crops rotted in fields because the reapers were dead or too scared to work. Bakers stopped baking. Millers abandoned their posts. Even livestock wandered loose, unmilked and unbutchered. If you were lucky, you had a larder and a locked door. If you weren't, you had hunger. One mainstream historical fact: between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death killed roughly 1/3 of Europe's population. That's not just a tragedy, it's an economic implosion. The food chain literally snapped. There were fewer hands to work the land, fewer carts to carry grain, and fewer cooks to feed the sick. In wealthier homes, meals shrank but didn't vanish. Servants were dismissed or died, but the pantry held salted meats, dried beans, flour. Stews still simmered, though thinner. In the countryside, isolated villages sometimes fared better, living off preserved goods and last year's harvest. But in towns, where food was imported and mouths were many, things got bleak fast. Here's your quirky bit. During the height of the plague, some people believed food could carry the disease, especially fruits with soft skin or meats that had cooled in the wrong air. A paranoid Parisian once reportedly burned his cheese because he feared it had trapped the miasma. Others fasted entirely, thinking a full belly made you vulnerable. Historians still argue whether starvation or disease caused more death in some regions. Was it the fever or the famine? In plague journals from cities like Florence, you'll see scribbled notes about people dropping dead in their kitchens or mothers rationing bits of crust to children already too weak to chew. And yet, somehow, people still try to cook. A pot of barley, a wilted cabbage, a piece of salted fish hacked with a rusty knife. They ate standing up, with gloves on, windows open, praying the steam didn't carry death. Others simply gave up, living on crusts, if that. Some looted. Some shared. Some closed their doors and never opened them again. Because during the Black Death, dinner was no longer routine. It was dangerous. And like everything else in that time, it came with a shadow. In plague-struck Europe, the difference between life and death could be measured by what sat on your table, or didn't. Because while the poor buried their dead in gnawed stale crusts, the wealthy dined behind locked gates, their kitchens still glowing with fire and spice. Picture a noble household. Stone walls, high windows, guards at the entrance. Inside, the kitchen still breathes. Servants wear cloths over their faces, but they stir the pots all the same. A silver platter arrives in the great hall. Roasted pigeon, aged cheese, stewed apples preserved from last season. Is it the same as before the plague? No, but it's food. It's cooked. It's served on plates. Meanwhile, in the alley below that same hall, a widow in a ragged saffron shawl digs through spoiled vegetables dumped from the manor's waste chute. She wipes off rot and eats raw parsnip in silence. Her children chew shoe leather. One mainstream historical fact: monasteries and noble estates had food reserves, granaries, smokehouses, root cellars, and preserved goods. These allowed the upper classes to ride out famines or disease waves longer than most. The poor, relying on markets or daily wages, had nothing but what they could find or steal. That gap widened dramatically during the plague. Some nobles even saw it as divine proof of their superiority. After all, they still had bread. There are accounts of feasts being held in near-empty cities, where 5 guests dined at a table set for 20, and the silence between courses was filled only by coughing. And here's your fringe tidbit. In some cases, plague doctors were bribed with food instead of coin. One letter from Marseille describes a doctor receiving a wheel of cheese and 2 smoked eels in exchange for visiting a house no one else dared enter. He accepted. Whether he survived, unknown. Historians still argue whether these class-based survival rates were strictly due to wealth, or if geography played a larger role. Rural nobles might have thrived, but city lords still risked infection from servants and street air. Still, the poor suffered most, not just from plague, but from hunger, panic, and exposure. In cities, bakeries closed fast, not for lack of flour, but lack of bakers. Some tried to break into mills to grind their own grain, but without firewood or yeast, the bread was dense, flat, barely edible. One chronicler writes of black loaves, burnt from haste and fear. Some poor households turned to corpse bread, a grim nickname for loaves baked in the homes of plague victims, sold at steep discounts. Superstition said the bread carried death. Desperation said, eat anyway. And still, the rich dined. Not lavishly, by no means joyfully, but with a sort of grim defiance. As if every roast duck was a charm against death. As if salt pork could shield them from sorrow. For some it did. For others, it simply made their graves fuller. Because during the Black Death, food wasn't just about class, it was about control. And for the starving, even a crust from the manor was worth crawling for. By the 2nd or 3rd wave of plague, hunger wasn't just creeping in, it had taken up permanent residence. With farmers gone, markets crumbled, and seasons out of sync, people turned to whatever they could find. And what they found wasn't always ideal. Out in the countryside, where barns stood empty and fields had gone fallow, villagers began foraging with increasing desperation. Tree bark, moss, wild onions, even dandelion roots were scraped, boiled, and mashed into something vaguely edible. Recipes weren't passed down, they were invented out of panic. You used what you could grab, and you hoped it didn't kill you faster than the plague. In towns, food lines formed outside convents and monasteries, but supplies ran low within weeks. Priests prayed, peasants begged, bakers locked their doors. Some residents scoured plague carts, not for valuables, but for crumbs in the pockets of the dead. One mainstream historical fact: grain prices soared during the Black Death due to scarcity and transport collapse. In some cities, bread cost 4 or 5 times its usual price, and riots broke out when hoarders were exposed. Bakers were sometimes dragged into the street and forced to sell their goods under threat of violence. And when there was no grain, people made do. A strange trend appeared in several written accounts. Bread made with ground acorns, dried bean husks, and even clay. These loaves were more stone than sustenance, but they filled the stomach for an hour, maybe 2. The taste? Charred bark and bitterness. Here's your quirky tidbit. One village in Flanders supposedly created plague porridge, a mash of cabbage, beer dregs, and roasted rat. Whether it was satire or survival, the name stuck. Historians don't all agree it existed, but variations of similar stew crops up in desperate regions across Europe. Animals fared no better. Chickens and goats were slaughtered not for meals, but to avoid the supposed plague vapors they might carry. Dogs vanished. Cats were blamed for witchcraft and disease, then later missed once rats exploded in number. Some towns banned the eating of street dogs, others looked the other way. Desperation, after all, has its own rulebook. Historians still argue whether people knew the risks of some of their substitutions, or if instinct just pushed them forward. Did they suspect moldy bread caused illness? Did they eat spoiled meat knowing it might sicken them anyway? Or was the choice already made, starve slowly, or risk everything for one hot bite? Families divided meals into smaller and smaller portions. Water was suspect, so some tried weak beer, boiled herbs, even rainwater trapped in pots. One English diary notes a man who drank vinegar for 4 days, believing it purged pestilence from within. It purged something, surely. And then there were the scavengers, those who roamed from ruin to ruin, looking for food where others saw only death. Abandoned homes, plague wagons, animal pens, anywhere something might be missed. They often ate alone, fast, and without light. Not for stealth, but to avoid seeing what they were consuming. In the end, food during the Black Death wasn't about flavor. It wasn't about fullness. It was about silence, what you could chew quietly before fate knocked on your door. And whether it was clay bread, rat stew, or nothing at all, every bite was a gamble. In monasteries, hospitals, and plague houses, food took on a different weight, no longer just a necessity, but a form of mercy. When a patient was beyond healing, the last warm spoonful of broth mattered more than a sermon. Because in a world drowning in death, one hot meal could still whisper, "You're not forgotten." Inside a plague hospital, the scene is solemn. Wooden beds lined with straw, cloaked figures moving between them with bowls and linen. The sick moan, twitch, or lie still. And from the corner, the cook appears, not a chef, not even a trained servant, just a tired monk holding a pot of thin soup. Turnips, if they had them. Barley, if they were lucky. He ladles it into small wooden bowls. The patient sips slowly or not at all. Sometimes the food isn't for nourishment, it's just something warm before the cold sets in. One mainstream historical fact: many hospitals during the Black Death were run by religious orders, especially nuns and monks. These institutions not only treated the dying as best they could, but also prepared and served simple meals, often based on meatless fast-day recipes. Broths, stewed grains, herbal teas. But food wasn't always welcome. Some believe the act of eating, while sick, increased the risk of bad humors. Fasting was encouraged in certain quarters, not for health, but for the soul. A clean gut was believed to make the passage to heaven quicker. So many refused food altogether, holding tight to prayer beads while ignoring the tray at their side. Here's your quirky bit. In some parts of Italy, death cakes were baked for the gravely ill, dense, spiced loaves meant to strengthen the spirit and, theoretically, help the soul cling to the body. These were often soaked in wine, infused with sage, and handed out alongside final blessings. Were they effective? No idea, but they tasted better than rat stew. Historians still argue whether these meals were acts of charity, desperation, or symbolism. Was the food given to ease the pain, or to give the healthiest sense of purpose? Some argue that monks focused on feeding the body only when healing the soul was no longer possible. Others suggest that food became the one remaining link to humanity in places where even hope had vanished. Outside the hospitals, in plague houses where entire families had been sealed inside, food was sometimes passed through small windows or left at the threshold. Bread, if there was any. Gruel. Once, a fish left on a shovel to avoid touching the door. For the caregivers, many of whom knew their own fates were sealed, cooking was an act of defiance. They boiled bones into broth long after taste had faded. They chopped roots with trembling hands. They served the dying with bowls that were cleaned again and again, as if the ritual itself could push back the dark. Because even as the bells tolled and the wheels turned and the carts rolled past, someone still stirred the pot. Someone still believed that a warm meal, however meager, might mean something. Food wasn't a cure, but for a moment, it could still feel like love. In the years that followed the worst waves of the plague, Europe slowly began to breathe again. The carts stopped rolling, the fires stopped burning, and the kitchens, tentatively, unevenly, began to refill. But something had changed. The survivors didn't just rebuild their food systems, they reimagined them. The fields were emptier now, fewer mouths to feed, yes, but also fewer hands to plant. Land once tightly held by nobles was left abandoned, and peasants began to bargain for better wages, more autonomy, and access to land. Some historians call it the beginning of the end for feudalism. Others call it the start of dinner tasting different. One mainstream historical fact: post-plague Europe saw a rise in meat consumption, especially among commoners. With fewer people and more land, animals grazed freely. Where once barley gruel reigned supreme, roasted lamb or pork became more common in peasant diets, at least for a time. Markets reopened, but they didn't look the same. Merchants sold different goods, preserved fruits, foreign spices, dried fish from coastal towns that somehow avoided the worst of the death. Vinegar became a favorite, not just for flavor, but for its supposed purifying properties. Garlic became common, sometimes chewed raw as protection, sometimes woven into food and superstition alike. And here's your quirky finish. In some English towns, survivors held annual plague feasts for decades afterward, a shared meal in memory of those lost. These meals included solemn prayers, yes, but also laughter, wine, and symbolic dishes like black bread or onions sliced in cross shapes. Eating became a kind of remembrance. Historians still argue whether these changes were deliberate innovations or just necessity rebranded as progress. Did people start baking better bread because they learned something? Or was it just that with fewer people, there was finally time and flour to spare? Some say the plague made diets richer. Others say it made them more cautious. What's certain is this: people never looked at food the same way again. What had once been routine became precious. Preserved apples tasted like autumn never left. Honey and tea felt like a small miracle. The humblest crust of bread was now a gift, not a given. And slowly, over generations, the trauma turned into tradition. Recipes born of scarcity became comfort food. Garlic and vinegar stayed on the table. Stews thickened. Flavors deepened. Food, once a battlefield of survival, became memory itself, rich, layered, and passed down from spoon to mouth. So today, when you eat something hearty and warm, something you didn't have to fight for, remember this: once, that same comfort was the final kindness before death. Once, it was the first signal that life might return. Now the fire crackles low. The bowl is empty. The door is closed, but the air no longer smells of fear. It smells of onions, of broth, of herbs chopped slowly and stirred by a steady hand. The plague is gone, but the hunger it left behind, hunger for safety, for warmth, for human ritual, still lingers in the kitchen. Imagine lifting a spoon to your lips and tasting not just food, but survival. That was dining during the Black Death, harsh, haunted, and unforgettable.